In this podcast, you'll learn how to use superlative adjectives so that your English grammar will be the best. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And my name's Craig.
And with about 50 years of teaching experience between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level, to the highest level, in fact. How are you, Craig?
I'm very well. In fact, I'm feeling the best I've felt for a long, long time. How are you, my friend?
Oh, I feel fantastic, on top of the world. Couldn't be better.
Well, we're starting off this week with a voice message from a friend of the show, Jesus. And Jesus has a question about council tax.
Hello, Craig. Hello, Reza. I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for recording this podcast because I'm sure that they helped a lot of learners like me. I want to ask you something about a podcast that you recorded where you were talking about rent a house. And I want to ask you if in UK there is a tax for rubbish. I mean, for retrieval rubbish. Here in Spain, as you know, there is a tax that you pay to the hometown to retrieve all the rubbish from your house or from your container that is near to your house. And I had a bad experience with that tax because it was write down in a contract and I didn't read that part of the contract. And when I left the loft, I had to pay a lot of money. It was a terrible situation. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you very much, Jesus, for your message. It was lovely to hear from you. And an interesting question. I like this question a lot. We're going to give you the knowledge that we have, which is not extensive, but we do know a couple of things. Before that, one or two comments on your message. I think you said it was write down in a contract. Better to use the passive there with written. So it was written down in a contract. Another thing, Jesus, was I think you said town hall. The town hall is the local council offices where you pay your local tax to, your community tax. So the town hall is the correct expression.
And your question, Jesus, you ask, Jesus, is there a tax for collecting rubbish? In the UK, yes, there is, and I bet there is all over Europe, if not every city in the world. You're talking about council tax. It's not just for rubbish. Craig, as far as you know, what is included when they charge you council tax apart from rubbish collection?
Let's see if I can remember from when I used to live in the UK more than 24 years ago. It was for the upkeep or maintenance of libraries. I'm not sure if they still exist, but libraries are paid for out of your council tax. The police and fire services, transportation, obviously buses and trams and trains and that kind of thing, and lighting the streets, which is very important, street lighting, and keeping the roads in good condition, so road maintenance. And there are probably other things that I can't remember that's included.
And you ask, Jesus, how much council tax should you pay or how much do you have to pay? Well, it depends. Every city, every town can charge a different amount. It depends on your own personal circumstances. For example, students pay less than people who have a job. Which valuation band your property's in. So people with very, very, very big properties might have to pay a bit more than people with smaller properties. And also, simply, how much money the council needs to spend. Some councils spend more than others. So if they spend quite a lot, your council tax is possibly going to be higher. So strangely, in England, I'm not sure if it's the same as Scotland, so I'd better not comment. But in England, it could be that the council tax for one area is higher than the neighbouring area, even though the cheaper council tax area might seem like a nicer place to live. It can happen. It doesn't necessarily mean, the place where all the posh, all the nice houses are, they'll have an expensive council tax. Often that's not the same. There's no correlation. It often depends on politics. And let's not get into politics, but certain political parties like to say that they charge less for council tax than others. So it can depend on lots of things.
Yeah, and I can't quite remember. Maybe you can, Reza. Obviously, if it's your house, you've bought a house, then you'll be liable or you must pay your council tax. And probably as well, if you're living and renting a house on a long-term contract, then obviously you also, I would think, pay your own council tax separately to the council. But what if you're living in a short-term rented property? I guess that will be the owner who then pays the council tax and maybe includes it in your rent. So you're paying part of your rent towards the council tax.
I think there's probably, it depends on how long you're going to be renting the place. I couldn't tell you what the rules are, but if it's long term, it's your responsibility.
Yeah.
If it's short term, it's the responsibility of the landlord, the person who owns the property. But I couldn't tell you exactly how long you have to be living there for it to be your responsibility. It depends.
So I'm guessing that maybe Jesus didn't realize that he was renting somewhere fairly long term. And then when he had to leave, he realized he had to pay, we call the arrears, which are the back taxes from the past. He had to pay it all together. So now you know, Jesus. Be careful next time.
By the way, in the past, Jesus, they used to call council tax rates, R-A-T-E-S. I suppose because that means different people pay different rates, different quantities, depending on how big your house was, etc. But about 30 years ago, more or less, or 40 years ago, they changed the name from rates to council tax. Apart from Northern Ireland, where I come from, where they never changed the name, strangely. And there weren't many obvious differences, except one. In Northern Ireland, we don't, until this day, have to pay separately for water because it's considered part of what you pay for your rates, which was the same case in the United Kingdom, the rest of the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, when they had rates. But when they changed to council tax, it coincided with the privatization of the water companies, and then you had to pay separately for your water. In Northern Ireland, we don't pay separately for our water. Whether it's a good idea or not, I'm not sure, but it's not metered. You do not pay according to the quantity of water you use in Northern Ireland. I'll repeat that because you'll find it hard to believe. It doesn't matter how much you use. Everybody pays the same. It's included in the rates. What about that, Craig? Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
I don't know if it's a good idea, but it's certainly one of the advantages of having constant rain every day, that you get free water and it's included in your rates. So
people are not going to run out of water there. There's not going to be a drought in Belfast in the future. We don't really worry about that.
Not anytime soon. So moving on to this week's focus, which is superlative adjectives. Now, if you didn't listen to last week's episode, why not? Where were you? We missed you. Last week we spoke about comparative adjectives. Words like hotter, wetter, more expensive than or cheaper than, nicer, less attractive than, etc. So if you didn't listen, go and listen before this episode. So you need to go to inglespodcast.com/453. Reza, what are superlative adjectives?
Well, superlative adjectives are just the next step up from comparative adjectives. In other words, they're used to describe a thing or a person, which is at the upper or, on the other side, the lower limit of quality. For example, the highest, the smallest, the cheapest, the best, the worst, etc.
So, for example, I could say, comparing cars, that a Volvo is more expensive than a Skoda, That's a comparative. However, if I include a third car, a Ferrari, I can say a Ferrari is more expensive than a Skoda and a Volvo, so therefore the Ferrari is the most expensive car.
Right, so as Craig has just shown you, we use superlatives to talk about three things or more: the Ferrari, the Volvo, and the Skoda. Whereas if you're only talking about two things, then you use comparatives, right? Superlative for three or more. And just like comparative adjectives, which we explained in the previous episode, there are two ways to form a superlative adjective as well. So if you remember comparatives, you add either at the end, er, or more at the beginning. Well, it's something similar for superlatives. If it's a short adjective, a short word, you add est at the end. For example, fastest, happiest, nicest.
Reza, you are the nicest person I know.
Oh, that's very nice of you to say
I
so.
know, you're welcome. I know many people, many people, and you are the nicest.
Flattery will get you everywhere. Thank you. Craig, what do we do if they're long adjectives?
Yes, we use the word most before the adjective. So expensive has 3 syllables. So we don't say expensivest. We say the most expensive. The same with intelligent, another 3-syllable word. The most intelligent. She's the most intelligent girl in the class. Can you think of any other examples to clarify even more?
The most uncomfortable, the most delicious, the most incredible, etc. So just put the word most before that. Now, if you listened to the previous episode, you might remember that we mentioned specifically past participle adjectives. That's adjectives, but they come from verbs, like the verb to interest. Yeah, sport interests me. Well, I could say that I feel interested in sport. So the word interested comes from the verb, but I'm using it as an adjective. As you know, Spanish language does the same. Well, with past participle adjectives, we always add most. We never add est at the end. It doesn't matter how many syllables there are. So, for example, the word tired, that's a past participle adjective. It's only 1 syllable. But we don't say tired plus est. We put most at the beginning because it's a past participle. Most tired, most used, most copied. It's irrelevant if there's 1, 2, 3, or 50 syllables. For a participle adjective, always add most before the word.
And the opposite of most is least. Least. The opposite of the most expensive is the least expensive. It's the most expensive car, it's the cheapest or least expensive car, or least intelligent person. For example, when guests come to stay in my flat, I always make sure I give them the least comfortable bed in the flat so that they don't stay very long.
That's a good strategy. That's a good strategy. Do you try to apply the 3-day rule? People often talk about the 3 days. 3 days is okay. On the 4th day, you're having arguments. Do you reckon that's true?
Guests are like fish. After 3 days, they start to smell.
Now, you may have noticed that we've been adding the word the before the superlative adjectives. We generally do. For example, Craig, you're the greatest.
Flattery will get you nowhere or everywhere. It depends. Thank you.
Sometimes I say to a particularly good student in class that they're the most hard-working students in the class. The most hard-working in the class. By the way, do you notice that I say in the class, not of? It's a typical Spanish speaker's mistake to say the best, the greatest, the most hardworking, expensive, whatever. In the class is the correct English, But Spanish think, it's de la clase. It must be of. It's not. It's in the world, in the class, in the city, etc.
Reza, what's the most expensive hotel that you've ever stayed in?
I never stay in very expensive hotels, but a friend of mine told me about an incredibly expensive hotel that he stayed in. It was in Monaco. Didn't surprise me at all. Yeah, Monaco, the casino. I think you can only get a permit to live there if you're a millionaire. I'm not joking. Only the richest people in the world are allowed to emigrate there. So a friend of mine said that the most expensive hotel he had ever stayed in was Monaco. It was like at least 500 euros a night for the cheapest room.
That's expensive.
Yep. By the way, if I go back to my sentence that my friend said to me, he said, the most expensive hotel I've ever stayed in was in Monaco. You're probably thinking, if you're a Spanish speaker, why didn't he put the word that in there? The most expensive hotel Spanish, right? That I've ever stayed in was in Monaco. Yeah, I can add that if I want, but we very often leave it out in a superlative sentence. You don't have to use it. It can be omitted. For example, it's the tastiest meal that I've had in a long time, or it's a bit quicker to say, it's the tastiest meal I've had in a long time. You can leave out the word that if you want.
Do you know what was one of the tastiest meals I've had that I can remember? Do you remember that Vietnamese restaurant that we went once? Well, twice. We went once with my sister, but the first time I went there, we had that lovely pho soup. That was absolutely one of the most tastiest things I've ever had. It was amazing. So I think that Vietnamese restaurant is one of the tastiest meals I've had in a long time.
Now, I just said a minute ago that we often use the with superlative adjectives. The best, the greatest, the tastiest. Yes. However, if you're using a word like my, her, our, or a word with apostrophe S, John's, Peter's, Craig's, then you can't use the word the. So, for example, he's my best friend.
My worst enemy.
Indeed, yeah. So I don't say he's the my or my the. I can't use the word the because I'm using my. If I didn't use the word my, then I would have to use the. I can't just say he's best friend. That doesn't mean anything. So I either have to say he's the best friend that I have, for example, like that, with the, or something like he's my best friend, he's your best friend. So we either use the or we use a word like my or our or something like that.
What's your most valuable possession? I think mine's my flat.
Yes, that's our most valuable possession. Our flats, yeah.
Yeah.
The one possession that we're determined that the bank will never take away from us because they could if you're not careful. And Craig, you know, you're my oldest friend in Valencia.
Well, I'm 59, so... But Mike and Archie are older than me.
That's funny you mentioned that because that's an ambiguous sentence, isn't it?
It is.
Yep. When you say that someone's your oldest friend, it could mean that there's nobody who has lived on Earth longer than them, or it could mean that you've known them more time.
So I'm hoping you mean the second.
The second.
Yeah.
You're not my friend who has had the most birthdays, but you are the friend that I've known the longest time. Yes, there's two meanings of that. Craig is my oldest friend in Valencia. And my best, by the way.
Oh, it's very nice of you to say. Now, with some two-syllable adjectives, like quiet or clever, we can use est at the end as a suffix at the end of the word, quietist, for example, or we can use most. Let me give you more examples. So I said quiet, the quietest. This is the quietest room in the house, or this is the most quiet room in the house. Clever is another word. Reza is the cleverest man I know, or he's the most clever teacher I know.
Really, you need to get out more. You
know,
need to see a bit of the world.
I don't go out very often. Narrow, the opposite of wide, Narrow. It's the narrowest street in the neighborhood, or it's the most narrow street around here. And simple is another example. listening to this podcast is possibly the simplest way to improve your English, or listening to this podcast is possibly the most simple way to improve your English. It really doesn't matter with some adjectives.
And it's definitely one of the best as well. After what Craig's just said, if you've listened to the previous episode about comparative adjectives, this is probably beginning to feel a bit like flashback. There's a lot of things in common, yeah? In the previous episode, 453, about comparatives, we also mentioned the fact that some two-syllable adjectives, when they're comparative, can be done two ways, like quieter, more quiet, cleverer, more clever. So it's something similar with superlatives. It does sound a bit like flashback, doesn't it? There are also some completely irregular adjectives that you just need to learn because they don't follow any rule. I imagine, I hope, that you already know the very important words good, better, the best. Yeah, so the comparative of good is better and the superlative is the best.
And when you get married, you might say for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, etc. Bad is the opposite of good. I'm sure you know that. The opposite of better is worse, W-O-R-S-E. And the opposite of best is worst, W-O-R-S-T. So good, better, best, and bad, worse, worst. Things are going from bad to worse.
Far, F-A-R, is an interesting word. British speakers of English always use the word further as the comparative. They change the A, F-A-R, they change it to a U, F-U-R-T-H-E-R, adding an H. So far, further, and superlative, the furthest. But if you listen to American English, they don't change the letter A to a U. It remains an A, but they do add that H in the middle. So Americans say far, farther, the farthest. And British say far, further, the furthest.
Be careful of the pronunciation of further, F-U-R-T-H-E-R. The first vowel sound is like in words like turn or learn or burn. So it's further and furthest. Although I also think, I don't know if you agree, Reza, that far, F-A-R, tends to refer more to physical distance, tangible distance, whereas F-U-R, further, could mean maybe not such physical distance, but maybe distance that is more idiomatic. For example, that couldn't be further from the truth. If I say it's further from the truth, I'm not talking about miles and kilometers and meters. I'm talking about something a bit less tangible.
Yes, that's true. Nobody would ever say that couldn't be farther from the truth, would they? Not usually. We prefer further for that.
Or to further my career, I took a course in blah, blah, blah.
As a verb, yeah.
You can use it as a verb as well.
Farther with an A is definitely not a verb, is it?
Nope.
No, that's true. That's a good point.
And then we can use words like little and less and least and much and more and most and fun. What's the comparative of fun, Reza? We spoke about that last week.
We did. Remember, this is a special case and it's a word you hear a lot. Fun, divertido, entertaining, right? More fun. Not ER, yeah? Even though it's one syllable, it's a special case. Fun, more fun, and the superlative is the most fun. I'll remind you, just like I did in the last episode, don't confuse it with the word funny, which means humorous, yeah? Fun is entertaining.
I've just thought of an example. Podcasting is more fun than planning English lessons, in my opinion. And the most fun I've had in the classroom has been teaching conversation because there's no exam, you do interesting interactive activities. So that's the most fun I've had in the classroom.
And without any doubt, the least fun aspect of teaching is correcting writing. It has to be done, it's important, but would you agree it's the least fun aspect?
I think... No, I think the administration you have to do, the admin connected to the language school is worse.
True.
Having to do reports and keeping registers and Excel sheets. I think that's worse.
That's a good point. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. I wish you hadn't reminded me, but you're right.
That's the worst thing about teaching. Let's look at some other conversation topics and have a discussion practicing these superlatives. So, Reza, what is the most interesting country you visited?
Oh, that's a good question. The most interesting country? Probably Cuba.
Why?
Because it's so unlike most other countries. It has a very particular form of governance. And also the people there are good fun. And I saw unusual things like people dancing in restaurants. Like they would have a meal and they'd finish the main course. But before dessert, maybe have a little dance. That type of thing. It was just very, very relaxed. One of the most relaxing places I've been to. Although slightly stressful if you're a tourist and you go to a very tourist area, because people know that tourists have money and the local people don't have so much money because salaries there are restricted. But nobody bothers you, people just want you to have a good time. But if you don't spend all your time in the tourist areas, it's definitely one of the most interesting countries I've been to. I think you've been there too, haven't you?
I have, and I agree with you. It's maybe not the most interesting, but definitely one of the best holidays I've had was in Cuba. I really had a wonderful time there. I think for me, and I've been lucky that I've traveled to many interesting places, I think Japan is possibly the most interesting culture I've seen because the people are the most organized that I've ever seen, the most polite. The religion is the most diverse I've seen, and the way people live and interact with each other, it's the most interesting for me personally. But everybody has a different idea.
It's interesting that you should say that because definitely Japan is the country which is highest on my list of countries to visit. Why haven't I done it yet? Because it's very far away. You need a bit of time and planning to go there. But it's definitely the number one, the highest country on my list of countries that I would like to visit. I also am very interested in their respectfulness.
Yes.
They seem to be the most respectful nation on earth. And I like that. That appeals to me.
Definitely more respectful than the British, that's for sure. What's the best concert you've been to?
Without doubt, seeing live Ravi Shankar, the Indian musician, play. I got to see him play for free. I doubt if I'd have been able to get a ticket.
Was that why it was the best concert? You didn't pay for the ticket?
No, I would have happily paid for the ticket, but I was an usher. USHER, the people who show you to your seat, etc. I was a student, and at the place where I studied, he was performing, and I volunteered as an usher really quickly, and luckily I got accepted, so I got to see him for free, and even talk to him afterwards.
Well,
and I was surprised how humble he was. He was really down to earth. He took an interest in me. I said, oh, well, I'm learning the violin. He said, oh, yeah, I used to play the violin years ago, but I found it a bit tricky. So humble, it was a bit too hard for me. So, I just decided to play, the sitar and be one of the greatest musicians who's ever lived on earth, But he didn't say that.
Isn't he the father of someone famous? Is it another singer, a female singer?
Norah Jones.
Norah Jones, that's it.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, he didn't admit it for a while, but eventually, not long before he died, he did admit that he had a child with a woman who wasn't his wife. That's right. And she turned out to be a fantastic musician herself.
Yeah.
He also has a daughter called Anushka Shankar, who's a famous Indian musician too. But that was the most spiritual concert I've ever been to because, as is important in Indian classical music, it's not just the music. Somehow it has to transport you somewhere. You have to travel in your mind. I mean, the raga, it's like the musical equivalent of a mantra. And honestly, it was one of the most spiritual things I've ever seen in my life. He was at the top of his career. He was about 65, 70 years old at the time. He'd been doing it for a long time. And he was just like a vehicle of, spirituality. It was just amazing.
Sounds fantastic. Yeah, sounds amazing.
What about you? What's the best one you've ever been to?
I think probably Santana.
Oh, cool. I love Santana.
And that was at the Royal Albert Hall, I think around 1985, 1986. Now I'm showing my age, but they played for over 3.5 hours without a break. And it wasn't spiritual exactly, but it was really good music. And I just loved every second of it. And we had really good seats. We were 3 or 4 rows from the front. So we were right in the center of the action. It was amazing.
Did he do, what's it called? Oye, como va?
Yeah, Oye, como va, of course.
I love that
yeah,
song.
Black Magic Woman, all the classics.
Love a bit of Carlos Santana.
Reza, what's the least interesting work or job you've ever had or work you've ever done?
The least interesting. I think it was my first ever job. My mum got it for me because she worked in the same place. She worked in a camera video store. So obviously that was a long time ago. There are not many left now, unfortunately. Video stores? Not many. I mean, where they sold like video home recorders and that type of thing. So we're talking about the mid-1980s, and it was very boring. And not only that, but I was out of my depth. It was too difficult for me.
What does that mean, out of your depth?
That I was not up to the required standard. I didn't know what I was doing. So people would come in and they'd say, things like, give me a 36 exposure, 400 ISA, blah, 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 Ilford black and white. And I was like, what were you talking about? Ilford? What? Who mentioned the place? Ilford, it turns out, is a type of film made in Ilford. And I just didn't know what I was selling, and it was embarrassing. And people say, well, let's compare them. And oh, this, that, this and that. Which one has the most extensive lens speed? I was like, oh, no. And they kept asking me questions in superlatives, actually. Which one has the slowest exposure? I have no idea. I have no idea what I was talking about, and I still don't. So it was probably boring because I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah, you felt out of your depth.
I know you've done a pretty boring job. Was it something to do with... Did you actually make cardboard boxes or something? What was it? Something like that?
Cardboard boxes were involved, yes, but I had to sort or arrange coat hangers. When you hang up your coats or your shirts or your blouses, you hang them on coat hangers and hang the coat hangers in the wardrobe. Well, I worked for a guy who bought coat hangers that were mixed in a huge cardboard boxes, and my job was to count 10 coat hangers, put them in the elastic band, and then organize them in different cardboard boxes for 6 or 7 hours a day for 6 weeks, every single day, in a basement with no window. And I went absolutely mad, but I was saving up to travel. I was still at school, so it was a holiday job, but it was the most boring job you could imagine. Luckily, it was only 6 weeks.
I must say, you're quite right. I cannot imagine anything more boring than that. I just can't.
Do you know what? You know what saved my life? I had a radio. So I just listened to talk radio and some music while I was working. That was the only thing that kept me sane.
Unfortunately, in those days, there was no such thing as podcasts, only radio. But now, listeners, now with technology, if you find yourself in such a mind-numbingly boring job as Craig's, you could listen to our podcast, couldn't you?
Yes, you could. And that would make you even more bored, perhaps. Reza, another question before we go out the door. What type of cheese, in your opinion, is the tastiest?
Well, I know which cheese is the least tasty. That's easy. The tastiest, I'm not sure. The least tasty cheese is any cheese made in the United States. That's a fairly easy question.
American cheese.
Yeah. As Charles de Gaulle once famously said to attack some American who had criticized France, he said, Oh, what do you know about my country? How can you run a country with 700 types of cheese? Nothing. Because, of course, the French have many types of cheese. The Americans have one, crappy, tasteless, processed cheese. And he was making a point about that. So American cheese is the worst on earth. There's no doubt about that. British cheese is very good, by the way. Hey, don't knock it.
Yeah, British cheese is good. My favourite, I think, is Idiazabal, which is from Spain, from the north of Spain, from, well, the Basque country. And it's sheep's milk cheese, which I love. It tastes a little smoky, although it isn't smoked cheese, but that is definitely my favourite cheese.
I know that my favourite blue cheese is English. Don't get upset. Roquefort, not bad. Asturian, blue cheese, Cabrales, better than Roquefort. Very good. But I'm sorry, Stilton gets my vote for the best blue cheese. Yes, an English cheese is the best blue one, in my opinion.
I think the best blue cheese is Roquefort.
Oh, we're going to have to agree to disagree there.
It's creamier than Stilton, in my opinion.
But I like Stilton because it's the crumbliest of all the blue cheeses.
The crumbliest.
I like the crumbliness of it.
What does crumble mean?
If something's crumbly, and Stilton is very crumbly, in fact, it's the crumbliest of all blue cheeses. I didn't make that word up, it really exists. It's the crumbliest. When you touch it, you cut it, it falls apart. I like that. Craig, in your opinion, what's the least difficult aspect about learning Spanish? The least difficult, or the easiest, if you prefer?
That's a good question. I suppose it depends which language is your native tongue, your native language. But for me personally, I think it's possibly vocabulary, because there are some words that I can guess the meaning of because they're Latin based, for example. And when I started learning Spanish, the pronunciation was difficult for me. The grammar is still difficult for me. So probably the least difficult or the easiest is vocabulary for me. What about you?
Well, although it can be tricky, for me, pronunciation is the easiest because, of course, as all our listeners know, Spanish is a phonetic language. Read what you say. You don't have to think much about it. Read it, say it. And poor listeners, as you know, English doesn't work that way. I'm always saying to my lower level students, don't say what you read, say what you know.
You know it's not or what you can know.
Yeah, exactly. You know it's not tonight, it's tonight. So don't say tonight because you know it. And when I speak to them and they're not reading, they go, oh, tonight I go to. And then I say, read that. They say, today he has many things to do. Tonight. Why did you say tonight? Like, oh, because it's written GHT, but you just said tonight. Yeah, but I read it. Tonight.
Yeah.
Don't read what you see. Read what you know in English. So for me, Spanish is very easy that way.
That's true.
Read what you see.
Absolutely true. And what do you think? Now it's your turn to practice your English. We would love to know what you think connected to the questions we've been discussing. And you can give us your opinion and practice your superlative adjectives. You can send us a voice message. Go to speakpipe.com. That's speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. Reza, how can people contact us by email?
You could write to craig@inglespodcast.com or belfastreza@gmail.com.
And this podcast is sponsored in part and supported by mansioningles.com, where you can study English for free. And if you would like a paid course, go and visit the online store, which is at store.mansioningles.net. As
always, we'd like to say a big thank you to all those listeners who help us by supporting the podcast through the Patreon scheme. And what those people do is they donate money. It can be as little as $1.50 per month. 50 cents is to cover the tax. And as a thank you for those people who donate that money, we give them instant access to recent audio transcriptions. If you're interested in supporting us that way, have a look at the link in the show notes, patreon.com/Ingles podcast.
And we'd like to say a huge thank you to recent Patreon supporters. Unfortunately, we can't mention all of you, but we will say hello, hi, and thank you to Chema de Lamo, Hector Gomez Soria, and Tomas. Thank you to you three and to everybody who is supporting us on Patreon. What's next week, Reza?
Next week, we're going to talk about stories from school.
So join us next week for some stories from school, our school days. Until next time, have a wonderful week. Thank you for listening. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pids. The track is called See You Later.